So this is part two of how Roosevelt handled the Great Depression, and we're going to talk about the second New Deal. But first things first, think about the last presentation we talked about Huey Long, College for All. Every man's a king, and he was working from the bottom up. Think about FDR using new technology and the way that transforms his presidency and the way he can communicate with his population. We've had other presidents coming up, and you've got some that you may remember in your lifetime that have pioneered new technologies to get to get the message across to our population. And think about government involvement in our economy. As I said, we were a laissez-faire nation pretty much before 1887, and the government gets involved more and more. So we're a mixed economy really before FDR comes along. But with FDR bringing in these programs, think about how we look to the government now to solve these major problems we have. And think about our modern day times and how our modern day government is responding to this, because we have a crisis right now where I can't be with you guys. And think about how our federal government is handling this. So moving on. Second New Deal. 1935. More programs to try to help people out and get them employed. Nope, let's go back. So it began in 1935, and they focused more on reform and recovery. These programs help farmers and farm workers. WPA, Works Progress Administration, with a $5 billion budget in 1935 money, set out to create as many jobs as possible, as quickly and as rapidly as possible. It employs more than 8 million people, built 850 airports, 650,000 miles of road, 110,000 libraries, schools, and hospitals throughout this nation. Employed writers, artists, actors, and musicians. Remember the slave readings I had you guys read if you were in my American 1 class? Those slave readings come from the WPA. We actually had people go out, writers go out and record these former slaves talk about what it was actually like. It's the only time in history we have recordings of actual people who went through that institution. These recordings are held in Pennsylvania in a mine in our most secure location because of deterioration and all that good stuff. But anyway, back on to these programs. The Banking Act of 1935 created a 7-member board to regulate the nation's money supply and interest rates on loans. More programs. The National Youth Administration 1935. This program provided part-time employment to more than 4.5 million college and high school students. This program also provided financial aid for college and vocational training. The USHA, the United States Housing Authority in 1937. This program provided federal loans for national home improvement programs. Gave low-interest loans, low-interest money loans to states to improve neighborhoods and communities. This was kind of like HUD before HUD was created under Johnson. And then we have the Social Security Act of 1935. This is probably the most lasting program of FDR's New Deal, and it comes with the second New Deal. And it's one that directly affects all Americans today. And this was set up for elderly old age pension, and it does a couple of other things which we'll talk about here. Well, maybe. Let me go back. So, Social Security Act is set up a monthly retirement benefit after you turn 65. It's not quite 70 today. It's 66, I believe. So unemployment, it sets up unemployment insurance, and that's going to be administered at the state level and is funded by a tax on employers. Basically, when you're hired, your employer pays a tax to the Unemployment Commission to provide for people when they go unemployed, when they're fired from a job, laid off, or when the economy stops because of a virus. So this unemployment insurance is administered at the state level. So Social Security not only pays for elderly age retirement, which means you can retire at 65 and get a federal benefit. You have to pay into the system, though. It's not you get it free. They take it out of every one of your paychecks. And it aids families with dependent children and disabilities. So if you have a child who was born with a disability, a severe disability, physical or mental, you can apply for federal aid to get federal money for this child. Now, you'll see that this program does leave out farmers and domestic workers. Think of what a domestic worker is. That would be a stay-at-home mother or a stay-at-home father in today's world. So it leaves these groups out. But most Americans today benefit from the Social Security Act. And so let's see. Let's move on. I had something else to say, and I can't remember what it is right now. So it is like a trust. It is like a trust fund. And what happens is both you, the worker, and your boss pay into it. If you want to know, you're going to pay, both of us together, workers and employers, pay 12.4% of every one of your paychecks you'll ever get claimed on taxes. 12.4% goes into Social Security of each one of your checks. Now, you don't pay the full 12.4, and neither does your boss. You'll pay 6.2%, and your boss pays 6.2%. So, as you see, unemployed insurance and dependent families with disabled kids insurance. Now, the thing about this Social Security Act is your modern day health care that President Obama passed, or President Obama sponsored in 2010, and he signed into law. That operates very much the same way as Social Security does with health care, and that is we all pay into it. The young pay into it, the old pay into it, with the premise that the older people are probably going to have more health needs than the younger people. So that's why there was a big push to get the younger people to pay this to help the generation before. Social Security does the same thing. You're a young worker, you're paying into the system, but you're not going to get that money. It's the elderly right now that get the money. You get that benefit when you turn 65. So labor relations improvements, the National Labor Relations Act, aka the Wagner Act, the NLRB, which is still in existence today, gives companies the right to unionize. So basically, unions are seen as a positive, or they're legalized. We've had feedback, we've had pushback from other presidents in the past, and we've talked about presidents not liking unions and stuff like that. The business of America is business, that sort of thing. But under the National Labor Relations Act, unions are legitimized. Collective bargaining or binding arbitration, collective bargaining and binding arbitration are used. Anti-union practices are banned, and the government can be a mediator. Fair labor standards. Finally, in 1937, with the Second New Deal, with the fair labor standards, child labor ends. What happened with the AAA and a couple other of his first New Deal programs, the Supreme Court found them unconstitutional, so they had to go back and change some wording. And with this Fair Labor Standards Act, children are no longer allowed into workforce, and you have a minimum wage established and a 40-hour work week. So we finally get those things in 1937. So you have the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, encouraged farmers to join cooperatives to bring electricity to their farms. Despite its efforts, only about 40% of American farmers were electrified. In other words, had electricity. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, passed by Congress, gave FDR the authority to oversee the safety of certain products. So with every administration, especially presidents that serve 2 terms, you always kind of have a scandal that makes them not look as good as you thought. Even Washington had this with Jay's Treaty. So with Roosevelt, it's going to be the Supreme Court. And Roosevelt gets tired of the Supreme Court deeming some of his New Deal programs designed to help the poorest of the poor and to help people struggling. He got tired of the Supreme Court, which was an aging Supreme Court, from ruling against him and throwing his programs out. So what he wants to do is he wants to add 6 new Supreme Court justices, which basically you can do that, by the way. We started out, I believe, in this nation with 6, and in 1800 we added the 7th one, and in 1870 we added the 8th and 9th one. So he was pushing to up the Supreme Court number of justices so he could get, of course, if he appoints the justices, he'd make sure that they would be in line with his New Deal program. So it's called the court packing case, court packing scandal. Several New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional, the AAA, the NRA, and so Roosevelt proposed adding justices because he said, hey, we need these programs to stick around. Now, a lot of Americans see this as a threat to our checks and balances, so this was seen as a scandal for him and a black eye for him. So, 1937, there was evidence that there was some recovery. He's going to pull back these programs, and the Great Depression returns. This is a huge mistake he makes, but as much as he's seen as a champion of putting programs in, he did not want what he called a welfare state, or he did not want a handout state. He was just as fearful of that. He was just as fearful as that as people are today of this, and even his Republican counterparts back then. So he pulls back these programs, but he does it too early, and the Depression returns, and it hits us again. So he made a mistake there in 1937, which was also the year of the court packing scandal. So 1937, not a good year for Roosevelt. Opposition will grow to continued government control. People don't like it. And then you get international affairs begin to take precedent over domestic affairs. Case in point would be Hitler. So here's how much we spend in the government, and it goes through 1945, but focus on 1933 to 1941. We are $22 billion in debt in 1933 when he comes into office. In 1941, when World War I starts for us, we're $50 billion in debt. So he really spends about $30 billion. And I think the overall price tag would be like 50 something billion. But in this graph, you'll see about $30 billion. Look at how much we spend on fighting World War II. You know, that's a graph I'll put up for you later. But World War II is our single greatest expenditure in our history up until 1980, up until President Reagan comes into office. World War II is our single greatest expenditure, $258 billion in debt. So I will probably end this section here, and I'll pick up with the Depression culture in part 3. But think about Roosevelt. Think about some people he left out. This was an economic crisis, and he had to have Southern Democrats on board with passing all these New Deal laws and regulations. So African Americans and civil rights will be left out. He will not talk about them. He actually uses his wife as a mouthpiece for civil rights. And she goes around touring the nation, talks about civil rights, and but he won't say anything about it because he's got to keep this New Deal coalition together, and it's very political. And he is a master at doing it, although it did leave African Americans out. So I'll pick up with culture here on the next